Loneliness is often described as something that happens to women, as if it were imposed by society, men, or a circumstance. But the most uncomfortable truth is this: the deepest loneliness is rarely inflicted. It is chosen, not consciously and not deliberately, but through a long chain of emotional decisions, defenses, and avoidances. Carl Jung warned that what we refuse to face within ourselves does not disappear. It returns as fate. Loneliness is one of those returns. It is not simply the absence of a partner, but the presence of inner walls. In the modern world, women have more freedom, choice, and autonomy than at any other time in history, yet report unprecedented levels of emotional isolation. This is not a coincidence. It is a contradiction born from a distorted idea of strength. Culture teaches empowerment without introspection, self-worth without self-examination, and independence without cost. The result is an identity that appears confident from the outside but remains emotionally unreachable on the inside. Loneliness becomes the shadow of that identity. Jung described the shadow as everything we deny, avoid, or reject in ourselves. When vulnerability is framed as weakness and emotional need is treated as shame, the shadow grows silently. Relationships do not fail because of lack of opportunity, but because of fear of exposure. To be chosen requires being visible, and visibility requires risk. Many women unknowingly construct lives where admiration replaces intimacy, attention replaces presence, and control replaces trust. This creates a painful paradox. The more protected the self becomes, the less reachable it is. Loneliness is not proof of being unwanted. It is often proof of being inaccessible. The tragedy is not that no one comes close, but that closeness itself has been labeled unsafe. The question is no longer why love does not arrive, but what within refuses to be met. Loneliness is not an enemy. It is a message. It reveals where identity has hardened into armor, where independence has turned into insulation, and where self-protection has quietly become self-sabotaged. The path out does not begin with blaming the world, but with the courage to turn inward and confront what has been locked away in the name of strength. Modern loneliness is not born in silence. It is born in performance. Many women are not emotionally alone because they lack attention, but because they live behind carefully maintained facades. The contemporary world rewards confidence, clarity, and self, but punishes uncertainty, need, and hesitation. As a result, emotional life becomes curated rather than lived. Social media does not simply reflect this shift, it amplifies it. Women learn early that visibility comes from strength and control, not from vulnerability. The message is subtle but constant. Be independent. Be desirable. Be complete on your own. Over time, this ideal becomes an internal rule, one that quietly reshapes emotional behavior. Needing someone begins to feel like failure, and longing feels like weakness. Yet Jung warned that when the persona, the social mask, grows too strong, it suffocates the self. Loneliness emerges precisely here, where authenticity is traded for presentation. Many women experience connection as exposure, and exposure as danger. They learn to manage emotions rather than share them, to signal availability without actually being open. This creates relationships that orbit intimacy without ever entering it. Abundance of choice intensifies the problem. When options seem infinite, commitment feels risky and disappointment feels unnecessary. Why invest deeply when another option is one swipe away? But emotional bonds do not form through abundance. They form through continuity and risk. The paradox is cruel. the more replaceable others appear. The more irreplaceable connection becomes in this environment. Love turns into evaluation rather than encounter. Partners are assessed, filtered and tested, but rarely met. Jung described this as inflation of the ego, where control replaces curiosity and judgment replaces presence. Loneliness then appears not as emptiness, but as exhaustion. Exhaustion from maintaining an image, from defending boundaries that no longer protect but isolate. The tragedy is not that no one reaches out, but that reaching in has become forbidden. True intimacy requires stepping out of performance and into uncertainty. And for many, this feels more frightening than being alone. The next layer of loneliness is harder to admit because it feels like wisdom rather than fear. Many women believe they are alone because they are selective, discerning, or unwilling to settle. What often hides beneath this narrative is not clarity, but protection. Expectations become emotional fortresses. They are not built to invite the right person, but to keep vulnerability. Outdot the image of the ideal partner slowly transforms into something unreal, someone emotionally flawless, instantly attuned, never disappointing, never demanding. Always safe, this figure feels protective. But it is also unreachable. Jung described this mechanism as projection, the unconscious placing inner conflicts onto imagined others instead of confronting fear of intimacy, disappointment, or loss. The psyche designs a standard no real human can meet. This allows avoidance to masquerade as self-respect. The danger is subtle. The more refined the expectations become, the less room there is for real encounter. Love is not an abstract concept. It is a lived process filled with misunderstanding, repair, and growth. But expectations shaped by fear reject friction. They demand certainty. Before trust and safety, before exposure, many women confuse emotional control with emotional maturity, believing that if they can manage desire, they can avoid pain. Yet pain is not the enemy of love. Avoidance is. When attraction appears, it is quickly analyzed, measured, and tested rather than felt. This turns connection into evaluation, and intimacy into negotiation. Jung warned that what is not lived consciously is lived unconsciously. As repetition, the same pattern reappears. Distant partners, missed timing, emotional unavailability. But now it feels external and accidental. Loneliness deepens because the true source remains hidden. Tragedy is not having standards. It is using them as armor. Real love does not arrive fully formed. It grows through imperfection, patience, and mutual adjustment. When expectations leave no space for human failure, they also leave no space for human closeness. The question shifts from why no one is good enough to what fear is being protected by never letting anyone be close enough. Loneliness reaches its most destructive form when strength becomes emotional inaccessibility. Many women are taught that openness is dangerous and that adaptation in relationships means loss of self. As a result, independence slowly transforms into rigidity. What begins as self-protection hardens into a stance that repels intimacy. Jung emphasized that psychological maturity is the ability to hold tension between opposites, autonomy and connection, freedom and attachment. When one side is absolutized, the psyche becomes unbalanced. In modern culture, Strength is often defined as needing nothing, asking for nothing, and bending for no one but. Relationships are not conquests, and they are not negotiations. Between two fortified identities, they are living systems that require movement, flexibility, and mutual influence. When emotional control becomes the highest value, spontaneity dies. Many women describe themselves as strong, but feel chronically unseen and unchosen. The contradiction lies here. Emotional availability is mistaken for weakness, and boundaries are used not to protect connection, but to avoid it. Attraction may appear, but it cannot stay, because warmth is met with evaluation and closeness with suspicion. Jung warned that when defenses dominate, the unconscious seeks expression through sabotage. Love is postponed, partners are disqualified, and timing is always wrong. This creates a narrative of bad luck, but the pattern is internal. The cost of emotional inaccessibility is not independence, but isolation. The more control is maintained, the less life is allowed to enter. True intimacy requires surrender of absolute certainty. It requires allowing another person to affect you, disappoint you, challenge you, and remain anyway. This is not submission. It is participation. Many women have been taught to equate compromise with oppression and softness with danger. But without softness, no bond can form. Loneliness persists not because no one is worthy, but because no one is allowed close enough to matter. The question is no longer why relationships fail, but what is being protected by keeping them at a distance. Modern culture often tells women that discomfort is injustice and that self-questioning is a form of betrayal. This narrative sounds compassionate, but it quietly undermines growth. Jung believed that transformation begins where the ego is challenged, not where it is endlessly affirmed. Unconditional self-esteem without self-examination produces stagnation. Rather than freedom, many women are encouraged to interpret every relational difficulty as external oppression rather than an invitation to inner work. As a result, responsibility is displaced, and loneliness becomes something that happens to them rather than something that reveals them. This creates a fragile sense of strength that depends on constant validation. Any compromise feels like loss, any adaptation feels like erasure, and any challenge feels like threat. But relationships are not spaces of static identity. They are dynamic processes that reshape both participants. When growth is framed as danger, love becomes impossible. Jung warned that avoiding inner conflict does not eliminate it. It drives it underground, where it manifests as repeated failure, resentment, or emotional numbness. Many women protect their self-image so carefully that they never allow it to evolve. They demand to be accepted exactly as they are, but refuse the mutual transformation that intimacy requires. This leads to a paradoxical loneliness. Surrounded by affirmations, yet untouched by connection. Real confidence is not built through slogans. It is built through integration, the integration of strength and softness, autonomy and dependence, desire and fear. This process is uncomfortable because it dismantles illusions. It requires grieving unrealistic ideals and letting go of identities built purely on defense. Culture rarely prepares women for this work because it cannot be packaged into empowering phrases or viral content. Yet without it, love remains theoretical rather than lived. Loneliness persists not because women are flawed, but because growth has been replaced with reassurance. Path forward is not harsher judgment, but deeper honesty, not asking who failed you, but what part of you is waiting to mature. This is where emotional adulthood begins, and where loneliness finally starts to lose its grip. The way out of loneliness does not begin with being chosen. It begins with choosing to be real, Carl. Jung believed that liberation starts when responsibility is taken for the inner world, rather than projected. Outward, no partner, no culture, and no ideology can replace this work. Love is not discovered like a hidden object. It is built through presence, patience, and the willingness to be. Affected, many women wait to be seen while remaining emotionally concealed. They long for intimacy while protecting themselves from its demands. This contradiction cannot be resolved by better strategies, standards, or affirmations. It can only be resolved by courage. The courage to lower defenses, to tolerate uncertainty, and to allow imperfection without retreat. True love is not safety. It is trust, earned through exposure. It requires allowing another person to disappoint you without disappearing, and allowing yourself to need without shame. Jung warned that what remains unconscious controls our destiny. And nowhere is this more evident than in relationships. When loneliness persists despite opportunity, it is not punishment, it is instruction. It points to where emotionally development has been postponed. Many women fear that vulnerability will erase their identity, but the opposite is true. Identity becomes rigid when it is never tested. Relationships do not weaken the self, they reveal it. This is why emotional maturity feels threatening. It dismantles illusions that once provided protection, but those illusions also prevented closeness. The final paradox is this: the more responsibility you take for your inner world, the less lonely you become, even before love arrives. Because loneliness is not solved by possession, it is dissolved by openness. When defenses soften, connection becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. And possibility is the foundation of hope. Love that lasts is not dramatic or perfect. It is lived. It grows in ordinary moments, conflict, repair, and mutual presence. The invitation is simple but demanding. Stop waiting to be chosen and begin choosing honesty over armor. This is not surrender. It is self-respect. The woman who allows herself to be known is not weak. She is finally available, and availability, not perfection, is what makes love real.